Cuentan que hace mucho, mucho tiempo.
Saludos todos y bienvenidos al canal. Y para mis suscriptores, bienvenidos de nuevo. Me llaman Austin en la calle, pero ya somos amigos, así que me puedes llamar Austin o Austin Teaches Spanish. Hoy vemos la película El Laberinto del Fauno del director Guillermo del Toro y hablaremos de lo que podemos aprender. There's a pretty good chance that you guys have already seen this movie. It's a very popular one. It came out almost 19 years ago. And in case you don't quite remember, it's the movie that's got this handsome fella in it right here. Scary guy. But an excellent movie. It is set in Spain, so there is a lot of Vosotros usage in this movie. If you haven't already seen my conjugation playlist where I go through all the different verb tenses and moods, definitely go check it out with the link up top. I go through Vosotros and Vos in my entire conjugation series, so you won't miss any of that. But yeah, we're gonna go ahead and watch a few clips from this movie, and we're gonna break down just piece by piece as we go through what we can learn from it. So let's get right into it, shall we?
Cuentan que hace mucho, mucho tiempo, en el reino subterráneo, donde no existe la mentira ni el dolor, vivía una princesa que soñaba con el mundo de los humanos. Soñaba con el cielo azul, la brisa suave y el brillante sol.
Okay, so the first thing I just want to talk about here real quick is where it says soñaba con el cielo azul. So the verb soñar, which means to dream, when we're talking about how we dream of something or dream about something, in a lot of cases in Spanish, the word de is used to say of or about. So when we say hablamos de, we're saying we're talking about. But the word soñar is different in this case. It always uses the word con with it. So when we say we're dreaming about something, we say soñar con. Now the word sueño could be either the simple present yo form of the verb soñar, or it could be the noun. So when we're talking about a dream, we could just say un sueño. If we want to talk about sleep as well, oftentimes we'll say sueño. So if we say I'm tired, you could say something like estoy cansado, but another way to say it, or to say I'm sleepy, is tengo sueño. So sueño could mean dream, or it can also mean sleep in this case. All right, let's move on.
Un día, burlando toda vigilancia, la princesa escapó. Una vez en el exterior, la luz del sol la cegó y borró de su memoria cualquier indicio del pasado. La princesa olvidó quién era, de dónde venía. Su cuerpo sufrió frío, enfermedad y dolor, y al correr de los años, murió. Sin embargo, su padre, el rey, sabía que el alma de la princesa regresaría, quizá en otro cuerpo, en otro tiempo y en otro lugar. Y él la esperaría hasta su último aliento, hasta que el mundo dejara de girar.
All right, so the next line that I've got for you guys is that hasta que el mundo dejara de girar. So that term hasta que means until. Now, the word hasta on its own can mean until if we're talking about like until a certain time frame or until a certain moment or anything like that. But if we want to say until a certain verb, until a certain action is completed, we're always going to follow that up with que, so it becomes hasta que. Now, hasta que could be used either for the indicative mood or the subjunctive mood. So with the indicative mood, we're going to be talking about things that we're certain of, things that we're sure are going to happen. Maybe they're regular events that happen all the time, or maybe we're telling a story and we're saying that something was going on until something else happened. So if I want to say, me quedé en el trabajo hasta que llegó mi paquete, so I stayed at work until my package arrived, that would be the indicative mood because I know that the package arrived. That's why I stayed there at work. But in this case, hasta que el mundo dejara de girar, it's using the imperfect subjunctive. So he's saying, he would wait until the world stopped turning. So the reason we're using the imperfect subjunctive in this case is because the king, who's waiting for the return of his daughter, he's not sure when it's going to be. He's not sure when the world is going to stop turning, but he's willing to wait until the world stops turning, if it ever comes to that. So that lack of certainty is why we're choosing to use the subjunctive mood in this case rather than the indicative mood. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to our next clip.
Hola. Hola.
¿Sois vos? ¿Sois vos? Habéis regresado. No os asustéis, os lo ruego. Mirad, mirad.
Okay, so we've just met the faun, and those of you who are up to speed on your conjugations, especially conjugations in Spain with Vosotros, might be a little bit confused here as to what's going on, because the Vosotros conjugations are used specifically in Spain, which makes sense here, the movie's set in Spain, but it's used for groups of people. It's used to talk to multiple individuals. However, he's describing the main character, Ofelia, as vos. So what's going on here? Why is he referring to a single person as vos, but he's using conjugations which are used for a group of people in Spain? Well, the answer to this is actually a little bit complicated, so I'm going to bring in my nerdy counterpart, and he's going to explain it for us before we go ahead and move on with more of the clips from the movie, okay? Okay, so this is a really interesting bit of linguistic history that deserves a full video at some point, but I'm going to try to be as brief as possible just to give proper context to why the faun is talking to Ofelia, to the main character, the way that he is, in that he's using vos to describe her, but he's using vosotros conjugations and pronouns with that os. So basically the story is, way back in the day, tú was the way that we would describe a single person, the way that we would say you. And vos was how we would say you all. It was the plural form, and it used the same conjugations and pronouns as vosotros uses today. What started to happen after a while, though, is that individuals in certain higher social statuses, like in government, certain dignitaries, royalty, people in the church, stuff like that, they started insisting on vos being used not only to describe groups of people, to say you all, but it was also going to be used to describe them as individuals with a higher form of respect over that standard tú form. So it uses the same conjugations that we see with our modern day vosotros. However, because it started to get a little bit confusing, vos was used not only to describe an individual, but to describe a group of people. They started using vosotros, which was just a contraction of vos and otros, or others. So it's you and others, basically, is what that means. But they still shared the same conjugations, which is a little bit confusing. And this basically started to fall out of favor because the people who were in those higher social statuses that wanted to be addressed as vos, they weren't happy with the fact that vos was being used too often. It was being used too regularly. It started to have a lot of informal usages. People were using it with family or people that they know well, not to specifically describe those people in the higher social statuses. So what happened at that point was they started insisting on another higher form of respect to describe them as individuals. So we ended up with this term, vuestra merced. So vuestra merced just means your mercy or your grace. And after a while, that vuestra merced started to get shortened down and it became our modern day usted. So we had tú, vos, and vuestra merced, which became usted. Now that vos usage really fell out of favor in Spain, and it is still used in a lot of Latin America. There's countries in Latin America that use tú, there's countries in Latin America that use just vos, and there's countries in Latin America that use both tú and vos, depending on the situation for informal context. And then usted is retained in all areas as the formal way of addressing another person. So we still have tú, and we have usted, and vos is just used in certain areas in Latin America to say you in those informal contexts. And we still have vosotros, which was retained only in Spain to say you all in the informal context, but ustedes, which was the plural of usted, started being used in Spain for formal situations, but it's used in all of Latin America to describe you all, whether it's formal or informal. So basically, as it applies to here in the movie with the faun, he's describing the main character, Ofelia, as vos, but using those vosotros conjugations because he's using an older, archaic form of Spanish where those conjugations for vos were still shared with the modern day vosotros. So even though it might seem like he's talking to her as though she's a group of people with his conjugations and usage of the os pronoun, he's not. He's just using an older form of Spanish that used vos with those same conjugations, and it's being used as a form of respect to refer to her respectfully instead of just calling her tú, even though he's talking to a single person. So yeah, that's pretty interesting if you ask me. Like I said, it's really complicated. There's a lot more to it than that. So we'll probably do a full lesson on that at some point. But yeah, that's why the faun is describing her as vos, but using those vosotros conjugations and pronouns. Okay, let's get back to the video.
Mi nombre es Ofelia. ¿Quién eres tú?
¿Yo? Yo he tenido tantos nombres.
Okay, so the next line I want to break down is where the faun says, Yo he tenido tantos nombres, which means I've had so many names. Now, so many in Spanish is going to be either tantos or tantas, and that's going to be derived from the root word tan. Tan means so. Not so in the sense of something is the case, so something else is going to be the case. That would be así que, or por lo tanto. But in this case, tan is going to be used as an amplifier. It's going to be used to amplify a certain characteristic of something. So if we want to say something like, her house is so beautiful, that's going to be su casa es tan bonita. So in this case, tan is always going to be used as an amplifier to say that something is so, whatever the adjective is, to amplify it. Derived from that, we've also got tanto and tanta and tantos and tantas. Now, tantos and tantas are going to be used to say so many, like in the case of the line here, he tenido tantos nombres, where he's saying I've had so many names. And of course, if we're talking about a feminine plural noun that we're saying we have so many of, that's going to be tantas. Now, tanto is going to be used to say so much. So in the case of saying I have so much food on my plate, that would be tengo tanta comida en mi plato, because comida is a feminine word, so it's going to have to agree with that in gender. So it's tanta comida. Now, tanto can also be used to say so much in the case of modifying not just how much of something that we have, but how much we do something. It can be used to modify verbs. So we could say to our significant other, te amo tanto. So tanto means so much. I love you so much. Te amo tanto. So we've got tan, which is used as an amplifier on an adjective. We've got tanto, which means so much of whatever, of a noun, so much of a particular noun, or so much to describe a verb, to amplify the verb. And then we've also got tantos, which is going to be used to modify plural nouns, so many. Okay, let's move on.
Nombres viejos que solo pueden pronunciar el viento y los árboles. Yo soy el monte y el bosque y la tierra. Soy un fauno, vuestro más humilde súbdito, Alteza.
No, yo...
Vos sois la princesa Moana, hija del rey de Bezmorra, el reino subterráneo.
Mi padre era sastre.
No sois hija de hombre. La luna os engendró. En vuestro hombro izquierdo encontraréis una marca que lo confirma. Por todo el mundo, vuestro verdadero padre hizo abrir portales que permitieran vuestro regreso. Este es el último de ellos. Pero debemos asegurar de que vuestra esencia no se ha perdido. Que no os habéis vuelto una mortal. Habréis de pasar 3 pruebas antes de la luna llena.
Okay, so I'm going to be really quick with this one before we wrap up this clip and move on to our next one. But where he says, habréis de pasar 3 pruebas, he's saying you'll have to pass 3 tests. Now, the interesting thing here is that usage of haber followed by de to talk about obligations. Now, this is a usage that is a lot more literary, a lot more poetic, but it can be used to talk about obligations in Spanish. So if I say something along the lines of, he de limpiar mi cuarto, I'm saying I have to clean my room. Now, the much more common usage that you're going to hear for this instead of haber de is tener que. When we say tener que, we're also saying to have to do something in terms of an obligation, but it's a lot more common usage. So it's a lot more likely that you would hear me say, tengo que limpiar mi cuarto. Okay, let's go ahead and wrap up this clip and we'll move on to the next one.
Este es el libro de las encrucijadas. Cuando estéis sola, abridlo. Él os mostrará vuestro futuro. Os mostrará qué hacer.
Aquí no hay nada. Al principio de los tiempos, cuando el bosque era joven, vivían en armonía los animales, los hombres y las criaturas mágicas. Se protegían los unos a los otros y dormían juntos bajo la sombra de un frondoso árbol que crece en la colina cerca del molino. Ahora el árbol se muere. Sus ramas están secas, su tronco viejo y torcido. Debajo de sus raíces ha anidado un enorme sapo que no lo deja sanar. Habrás de meter las 3 piedras de ámbar mágicas en su boca.
Okay, so we've got another usage of that haber de to talk about obligations, and this is coming out of a book, so it makes sense that it's going to be using that usage versus tener que because it is more formal, more literary. But the thing I really want to talk about here is that verb meter. So when she's talking about putting the magical stones into the toad's mouth, it's using the verb meter. Now, that can be used very similarly to the verb poner, which many of you guys already know, being to put. So to put the stones in the mouth, you could use the verb poner, but meter is going to be used to talk more specifically about putting something into something else. Now, it has a lot of different usages, which I've got up on the screen for you guys right now, scrolling through here. But just keep that in mind when you're talking about putting something into something else. If you want to sound more native and use a more accurate vocabulary, it's better off that you're going to use the verb meter instead of poner. Okay, let's move on.
Y recuperar una llave dorada que oculta en su vientre. Solo así, el árbol volverá a florecer.
Okay, so the last thing before we go ahead and wrap up is where it says, el árbol volverá a florecer. So that verb volver, which means to return, is used to talk about how we're going to do something again. So anytime that you want to talk about doing something again, you could use the term de nuevo. De nuevo also means again. But when you want to talk about doing a certain action again, it's very common that we're going to use the verb volver followed by a, and then our target verb in the infinitive. So in this case, it's saying the tree will bloom again. So it's volverá a florecer. Okay, let's go ahead and wrap up. Okay, amigos, well, that's all the time I've got for us today. Muchísimas gracias por ver. I hope that you've enjoyed and maybe learned a thing or two about the Spanish language. If so, go ahead and drop a like on this video. It's going to be a huge help to me and the YouTube algorithm to help grow my new channel. And don't forget, if you have any suggestions for future immersion exercises, go ahead and drop them down below. I'll check them out, and if there's anything there that can be learned about the Spanish language, I'll make sure to make a video and I'll give you the proper thanks that you deserve for it. Thank you so much. Hasta la próxima. Ciao.